And the consequences of this war extend far beyond Ukraine and Russia's borders. For more, we can cross the leads and speak to Tim Benton, who leads the Environment and Society program at Chatham House. Hello, Professor, and thank you for speaking to France 24. You've been looking into this quite closely, and it gets fairly technical, but tell us, what were some of the biggest risks you found so far?
Well, there are three kind of categories of risk. There's the impact on Ukraine and Russia and their ability to feed themselves and provide energy, particularly for Russia as the economy gets impacted by sanctions. We've got the impact on global food systems, particularly for countries like Egypt, Sudan, Laos, who import a lot of food that normally comes from Russia or Ukraine, particularly low-income countries. And then globally, we've got a cost of living squeeze accentuated by increasing energy prices, increasing food prices that everybody in the world will be impacted by. And local food insecurity is likely to increase. The number of people who can't afford to buy their food for their daily household needs is going to increase all around the world. So all of those three categories between them means that a lot of people will be affected.
And are those categories split up in terms of time? Is that a short-term, medium-term, and long-term, or is that all something we can already see right now as it's playing out?
Well, we can see it playing out now. There's the global cost of living squeeze driven by post-pandemic reconstruction meant that everybody was starting to feel the costs of inflation. The invasion has immediately driven up prices for food, energy and fertilizer. And as we look ahead, the consequences of changing markets, changing geopolitics. Where does China go? Do we end up with a bipolar world with China and Russia on one side and the Euro-Atlantic on the other side? How will trade work its way through over the next years and decades, let alone how will the conflict itself end over the next months and years?
Now, many Western economies are still trying to recover from the pandemic, and there has been somewhat remarkable solidarity in isolating Russia internationally. But are world leaders preparing for these risks that you've outlined?
I think there is an immediacy of worrying about how do we cope with the price rises. At the moment, there isn't enough thinking going on about how do we cope with these over the long term. And where we see in Europe or in the UK, the new energy strategy coming in about how can we wean ourselves off Russian gas, we have a degree of short-termism. And also for food within the European Union, talking about ploughing up nature areas to grow more grain, etc. It's going to be a long slog for us to work this through because this is a really redefining moment, perhaps as big as any moment since the Second World War.
Yeah, Germany, Europe's biggest economy, and it has taken some radical steps to try to isolate Russia, but it is, of course, the most reliant European country on Russian gas. Do you think it's gone far enough, or should it take further action?
Well, I think it also depends on how the war develops and what we need to do. There's certainly, we're holding some things in reserve, such as sanctions on oil and gas, as well as on coal. But the flip side is that the harder that we push on sanctions, the more global people will get hurt by the rising cost of living, and that in itself will lead to a whole lot of further implications. You know, China has already said that if it gets hurt by Western sanctions, it will put sanctions on the West. And as we go through the cost of living crisis on a global basis, more and more people in low-income countries might end up rioting about food prices or leading to recessions or sovereign debt crises and so on. So there is a lot of downside to economic warfare and sanctions that has to be thought through carefully because it will be globally impactful, not just locally impactful.
Yeah, we only have time for one more question, but I was wondering if you could outline that about the food prices, the global food insecurity, why Ukraine and Russia are so important, and what areas around the world might be most vulnerable because of these cascading effects.
Well, Russia and Ukraine between them are really responsible for about a quarter to a third of global grain exports, particularly wheat and also some oils. So countries are affected, particularly if they depend on the imports. So if you look at somewhere like Egypt, about 80% of its wheat for its local bread comes from Ukraine and Russia. But because global exports are really important for every country, even if you don't import food from Russia and Ukraine, you're affected by runs on the market as the world panics effectively to get food for its local population. So everybody in the world is going to be affected by increasing food prices, and so it will drive up for economically marginalized in low-income countries, but also in rich countries. It will drive up the inability of people to be able to feed themselves in a way that is fair and equitable.
Professor, thank you very much for your time and your analysis.
Thank you.
Tim Benton from Chatham House.
Thank you.